Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Cool.
Well, I am very excited to talk to Jason Silva today. I'm a huge fan of brain games, as are my children.
Well, thank you.
And
I'm happy to be here.
Well, first, for people who may not know, tell us about the show and why is it so important that we understand how our brains work?
Sure. Well, I describe the show as a pop science series that uses elaborate experiments to highlight your perceptions and misperceptions of reality. So sometimes we do hidden camera experiments, sometimes we do games like the one you just saw, and the point is meant to give you a sense of humility that your daily perceptions of reality that you take for granted, your everyday experience of the world, is colored, pardon the pun, colored by your preconceptions, expectations, prejudices, cultural upbringing. All these things inform, in fact, cloud your experience of reality, right? The brain doesn't have a direct experience of the world. The brain is behind 2 inches of skull, okay? It witnesses the world through limited information it gets through the senses and then fills in the blanks. And when you fill in those blanks, you're doing it with a bias. All of these variables, prejudice, cultural upbringing, stereotypes, all these things bias your world, color your world. And so I like to think that the show uses these games to turn you on to the mystery and make you curious and make you wonderstruck. And I like that.
Well, in addition to brain games, you also have this incredible video series, Shots of Awe, which I love to watch. Can you tell what inspired you to start that series, and what are you hoping to accomplish with that?
Sure. So Shots of Awe is an original series that publishes on testtube.com as well as youtube.com/Shots of Awe. And I describe them as trailers for the mind. It's very much a passion project of mine where I create these 3-minute films that I also narrate about technology and our relationship with technology, right? I mean, we all know that the world is changing very fast. Technology is advancing faster and faster and faster. And so what are the implications of this transformation? How is our symbiotic relationship with these tools changing who we are? The philosopher Marshall McLuhan used to say, first we build the tools, but then they build us, right? Everything we design is designing us back. And so that raises a lot of questions that I think are fascinating. And most people usually respond in a doom and gloom kind of fashion, They use their phones to tweet about how much they hate technology. And I think that rather than immediately be apprehensive of these changes, I like to just ask questions. I like to wonder. I like to marvel at the complexity that we are increasingly domesticating. And so Shots of Awe is where I probe these questions having to do with technology, but also with the human condition. Also with what it means to be mortal and long to be infinite. Creatures like us that make art, that write poetry, that make beautiful films, that build skyscrapers and make rockets that go to the moon and rovers that go to Mars, yet we're still mortal, finite beings. And that creates anxiety and tension. That's the human condition. And so I like to explore that on Shots of Awe as well. So, yeah.
Well, you seem to wear so many different hats. I don't even know, how do you most identify? I feel like you're an educator, you're a philosopher, you're a filmmaker, you're an entertainer, you're a poet. Are you all those things? Is there one that feels most natural to you?
Yeah, well, I went to school for philosophy and film because I love movies more than anything in the world. I think they are the highest art form. And philosophy because I love ideas. I relish cognitive ecstasy, which is a term I recently learned. It means an exhilarating neurostorm of intense intellectual pleasure. Carl Sagan, who used to be the original host of Cosmos, used to say that understanding is a kind of ecstasy. That when we're learning, we're getting like a kind of mindgasm, right? Like it feels good to discover something new, but most of the time, we're not really learning. Sir Ken Robinson has that great TED Talk about how our modern educational system needs a kind of firmware upgrade, that we need to go back to the sort of wonderment of what it's like to be a child, and we need to transcend the been-theres and done-that's of the adult mind. And so I think even as a little kid, I was addicted to being inspired. I was addicted to discovery and curiosity and wonderment. And when I went to school, again, for philosophy and film, was because I wanted to live in that space where those two things intersect. Big ideas presented in a cinematic way. So when you look at what Shots of Awe has become, and when you look at my involvement in Brain Games, which is a show that educates in a fun way, teaches you about your perceptions and misperceptions in an entertaining way, I think it's very much a marriage of my interests. So when I try to sort of put into context or describe or summarize what I am or what I do, I say, well, I'm a media artist, right? Because I use media. A friend of mine from the Imaginary Foundation, which actually made this crazy shirt, he once described me as an ontological DJ. Now, ontology has to do with reality. And so he says that basically I'm like remixing reality, right? Making you look at the world in a new way through some of these videos. And so I thought that was a cool term. So media artist, you know, wonder junkie, that's my favorite. Carl Sagan coined the term wonder junkie in the novel Contact that later inspired the film with Jodie Foster. I really like the idea of the wonder junkie, right? I'm just like, I'm addicted to wonder.
Well, speaking of wonder, I mean, one of the things I think a lot about lately is I feel like we're all so busy, we're all so overstimulated, we're like tethered to our phones, we have so many responsibilities, we kind of like often sleepwalk through our day, not really being present in the moment. And I was watching one of your Shots of Awe, you talk about eyes that see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel or understand. Do you feel that people are like not really even awake to the miracle and magic of life? And what do we do? Is this a growing concern, this kind of autopilot existence we're all in?
Yes, thank you for that question, because that's a big passion of mine. So what happens is anything that's always around becomes invisible, right? It's called hedonic adaptation. It's like the most delicious thing in the world. After enough bites, it's going to stop tasting delicious. And it's because your brain has become habituated. Right? So it fades into the background because it's more cognitively expensive to engage with the world, right? To be in a state of awe is tiring, and if we were marveling at the world all the time, we'd probably die. But nonetheless, we get a lot of pleasure from being in a state of rapture and in a state of awe and in a state of wonderment. But a lot of the times we get busy, and again, we have so much limited bandwidth, and there's so many signals competing for our attention. And so a lot of times the only response is to retreat, right? But then the question becomes, how do we shake ourselves out of that zombified trance state, right? How do we shake ourselves out of that stupor so that we can sort of awake? I mean, we're all chasing illumination. We're all chasing transcendence, right? And there was some recent scientific studies that were published in the news. They received a lot of press about the subject of awe. Now, again, I call my videos Shots of Awe, and I like to think that people watch Brain Games and get a dose of awe. And in the study, they described awe as a feeling, as an experience of such perceptual expansion, right? Such perceptual vastness that you literally have to reaccommodate yourself, right? To create new models of the world in your brain to assimilate that experience. So think of the first time you saw the Grand Canyon, the first time you saw an IMAX film of the Hubble Space Telescope. I mean, you literally have no reference points for what you're seeing. And so that acts as a decentering experience, pulls you out of context so dramatically that you're forced to gawk in amazement at the ubiquitous everyday wonders you're culturally disposed to ignore. And what they found is that these ecstasies, these awe-like experiences, after they pass, they leave residual feeling of increased creativity, increased well-being, increased compassion. So blowing our own minds is therapeutic, right? It's therapy. It makes us kinder, gentler, more creative people. Now, that's got to be a good thing to celebrate. And additional studies out of Berkeley recently found that experiences of awe are actually anti-inflammatory. So in addition to getting off and feeling more creative and compassionate and empathetic, all values that are necessary in the world, you also are getting like a dose of health, right? Anti-inflammatory effects. So, Timothy Leary used to say, in order to use your head, you've got to go out of your mind, and he was totally right. And so how do we package and disseminate media that blows people's minds? In fact, of all human emotions, the ones that is most likely to get you to share a piece of content or an article that you stumble upon is awe. If you feel awe, you are the most likely to share whatever triggered that, which is kind of cool. You don't hoard it. You want to share it. So anyway.
Well, you talked earlier. No, I mean, I think that, when we were talking about education, and I was thinking about, I interviewed Goldie Hawn a while back for Huffington Post. I don't know if you know, she has this Mind Up curriculum. She was talking about how important it was that children understand how their brains work and teaching mindfulness. So she created, with this neuroscientists and psychologists and this whole team, this curriculum that's in thousands of schools. And that was one of my questions is, do we need to start teaching these skills early on when we're young? Otherwise, do we become too habituated in our kind of unconscious thinking?
I mean, I think so, for sure. My mom is a teacher, so I grew up and an artist. I grew up in Venezuela, and I went to an international school, and I think what was interesting for me is I was exposed to people from many different cultures from a very young age. There was like 100 nationalities represented in my school. Additionally, I had a mother who was an educator, English literature, whose job was to awaken you from your sleep. Her job was to agitate the sleep of mankind. And so from a very young age, I sort of realized the difference between engaging, between being curious, between being in a state in which you are learning, experiencing neurogenesis, versus, being forced to memorize, a passage and then being tested on it. That never worked for me. Additionally, for elementary school, I went to a Montessori school. And those, again, they build the curriculum around the kids' passions and interests. In Finland, they're doing these experiments now where they're not doing specific subjects anymore, but they're teaching people by topic. So there's a topic, and it can include various different subjects, and it's all about like holistic thinking and transformative educational system. I mean, everybody has an iPad now, so it's not like you need to learn how to go to the library and research Encyclopedia Britannica. Like, the world is your oyster, A young person in Africa today with a smartphone has better communications technology than the U.S. president had 25 years ago. Now, if that's not a revolution in education and in access to knowledge, if that's not a democratization, an information revolution, I don't know what is. But then our traditional systems of education that are over 100 years old, like, come on, like, loosen up. Let's go with that rigidity and let's upgrade, open, new firmware.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah.
But you and I were talking earlier, we both have had, interactions with Deepak Chopra, and we were talking about expanded consciousness, and I was thinking I had interviewed him about this Sages and Scientists Symposium, and how, also scientists are becoming increasingly interested in proving the benefits of practices like meditation and the synthesis of science and soul. What's your take on that?
Well, yes, he did interview me, and we had a great conversation, actually.
Sure.
Science and soul. Well, yeah, I mean, for me, discovery has soul. Expanding our boundaries is a soulful endeavor. There's a great book called Rocket Men that talked about the appeal of space exploration. And what the author said was that when we dream of space, we dream of transcendence. We dream of what we might become. That's soulful. When we put a rover on Mars, that is us. That is our neocortex. That is our mind, okay, on the surface of another planet already, right? That thing is an extension of our brain, an extension of our cognition, crawling the surface of the planet. That is soulful, right? The problem is it doesn't get talked about in that way. And that is a failing in the communication of science today. Like, I remember I did a video about the future of space exploration. It was tweeted by NASA and Virgin Galactica, Richard Branson. And, again, it was about the importance of wonderment, of awe, of impregnating science with soulfulness, And I think that's very important because I just almost swallowed my microphone saying that.
Oh, please don't do that.
That's very important, I think.
Now, you're somebody I feel like you can ask big questions to. It would be a waste not to. So what is your personal understanding of the universe and reality?
That's a great one. There's a great quote that says that reality is coupled to perception, right? So if you change perception, you change reality. Now, to a degree, we have to come up with consensus. We need a consensus reality, green light, go, red light, stop, so that we can collaborate and cooperate and not just like bump heads against one another forever. So I get the idea of creating a consensus. But to a large degree, beyond the consensus, everybody exists in their own world. They live inside of their filter bubble. They live inside of what Robert Anton Wilson calls your cultural reality tunnel, right? Reality, as McKenna used to say, is made of language, right? The man-made world is congealed imagination, okay? If we could witness human progress over the last 100,000 years through like time-lapse photography, you know, when you speed it up, it would look like our thoughts and dreams spilled over into the world. I mean, everything we see was designed by the mind, okay? Like you look at the topography of New York City, and that is shaped more by mind than by geology. Those buildings were designed, okay? But again, everything we design is designing us back. So I think reality is a construct that we are constructing. We are reality engineers. And so I think it's up to us to, you know, again, to be constantly thinking about how everything that we do is feeding back into who we are, right? We are the music makers. We are the dreamers of dreams. We are creating ourselves. We are the creators, but we are also the created, says Kevin Kelly. Now, so that's in a nutshell.
That's a great definition. Now, one of the things that I often think about, because I know some of this, you know, just experiencing awe, you know, for your own self and your own life and your own experience. But I don't know about you, I feel a little concerned about the state of the world right now. There's a lot of serious problems that we face. How is this connected, this expanded consciousness, to, you know, not to be overstated, the future of humanity and the planet?
Well, look, I agree. I think there's a lot of problems in the world for sure, and I think that we have better tools now to address those problems than any other time in human history. There was a Time magazine cover story written by Bill Clinton called A Case for Optimism, and in the article inside, he cited a 2010 United Nations development study that said that forget about the info-haves and the info-nots, because in fact, the cell phone was the greatest invention in history to pull people out of poverty. I think a lot of the times in the media, which is responding to, this is another brain game, we have this thing called the amygdala. The amygdala is like the human alarm system, okay? And we are the descendants of the humans that were the most vigilant 100,000 years ago in the savannas of Africa. Those that were really scared all the time survived. They didn't get eaten by predators. Those that were chilling out got eaten. And so all of us have sort of inherited this overactive amygdala. So we respond to any alert. And the media wants to get our attention. So usually, if it bleeds, it leads, right? The worst possible story needs to make front page news because that's what we're going to pay attention to. But again, to give you an expanded consciousness version of that, if you actually zoom out, and I would point people to the work of Steven Pinker. He did a TED Talk called The Myth of Violence. And in it, he cites some of the research from his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he says, contrary to what you might intuitively believe, today, the world is actually less violent than it's ever been in all of human history. And that the chances of a man dying at the hands of another man today, globally, is the lowest than it's ever been in human history. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not problem spots all over the world, but it means that when you look at it holistically, and you look at it globally, and you look at it over time, we've actually never experienced such prosperity and peace as we're experiencing today. Which is not to say we don't need to address those problems, but let's not think that it's hopeless. If anything, let's think, oh my God, we've done well and we can do better.
And you mentioned Timothy Leary, and I had, you know, the honor of interviewing Timothy Leary. Yes.
Oh my God.
I know, right? Back in 1994, if you can imagine such a thing. It was a pretty cool interview. And what was amazing is that back then there wasn't even, the internet hadn't really become a thing, but he already foresaw the potential of, he called it the language, using the language of electricity and electronics, and to, you know, create a global village. You know, how do you view, you know, the promise, the potential, pros and cons of technology? It has such a huge influence on us right now. Yeah,
I love some of Leary's ideas. You know, he was the guy that used to say that we've experienced this cybernetic revolution, but he really called it a cyberdelic revolution because he said, and echoing Marshall McLuhan used to say that the computer, or in today's terminology, the smartphone, is the new mind-expanding drug, right? So in the 1960s, there was this psychedelic revolution and this idea that we could expand our minds, expand the boundaries of what we could perceive. And that has been literalized by the computer revolution. I mean, our smartphone is literally a mind-expanding substance, okay? It allows us to transcend our limitations and our perceptions and expand our world, instant access to all the world's knowledge and information. So that's already a shift a transformation potentially in consciousness. Now, there's always the problem that people could just use this tool to stay inside of their filter bubble and not expand their world, just amplify their limited world instead. But I would push people to take advantage of these tools, but it's ultimately how you use these tools. Another thing about technology is that it moves at speeds that are counterintuitive to how our brains evolved to see the world. You know, we've talked about this on Brain Games as well, but you know, we evolved in a world that was linear, in which things that occurred in a linear phase change, right? Like we made linear projections. How far away is that tiger before it comes and eats me? Like linear change. That's what we're used to. But technology evolves at exponential rates instead of linear rates. And most people are not privy to just the difference there. But if you take 30 linear steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get to 30. But if you take 30 exponential steps, again, same amount of steps, you get to 1 billion. Think about that. 30 linear steps gets you to 30. 30 exponential steps gets you to 1 billion. And technology evolves exponentially. That's why your smartphone is 1 million times cheaper, 1 million times smaller, and 1,000 times more powerful than what used to be a $60 million supercomputer that was half a building in size 40 years ago. So how does that change what's possible when the supercomputers of yesterday are now in everybody's pocket for a couple $100, right? That is a transformation in what's possible. And eventually these technologies are going to go inside of our bodies.
Do you think?
Oh, yeah. In the next 25 years, we're talking blood cell-sized devices, nanotechnology in our brains. Think of it. The same exponential trend that made half a building shrink into your pocket is going to shrink your pocket into a blood cell-sized device.
Wow.
So then most people are like, okay, this is scary, right? Frankenstein, like, I don't like this. But see, now I encourage, and this is where I start echoing the ideas of Timothy Leary, Kevin Kelly, founder of Wired Magazine, that we need to change how we think of technology and not think of it as this like unnatural thing. Because first of all, if it wasn't natural, it couldn't exist, okay? The same biosphere that sprouted us, and we sprouted technology, it's allowed by the laws of physics, it's all made of atoms, so it's all natural. And so what Kevin Kelly says is that we should think of technology as literally an extension of us, our second skin, an exoskeleton, an extended neocortex, still part of the evolutionary process. He calls technology the technium, the seventh kingdom of life. Okay? So when you think about it that way, then you think, okay, so us and our technology together put a man on the moon. Us and our technology together allows us to make, Skype calls, collapsing geography, communicating instantly with another mind across the ocean. Us and our technology allows us to get on a plane to fly to see the people we love. I mean, us and our, I think it was this guy called Alan Harrington who used to say, having invented the gods, we can turn into them. I mean, it's this notion that if we stand proud with these capacities, our ingenuity, our creativity allows us to ultimately transcend the greatest limitation of all, which is our finitude. Like, that's who we are. So I think the future of technology is a transcendence of all previous limits. And why not strive for something that ambitious? Why should we settle for anything less? Elon Musk says we should be a multiplanetary species. He wants to put humans on Mars. That's a great start. Hell yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you and I were talking earlier also about, Oprah's Super Soul Sunday and just a lot of programming and conversations about, the evolution of our consciousness to a higher state. Do you see, I feel a shift is happening.
Huge. And here's where I could tie the idea of consciousness and art and beauty back to technology. A great example that Kevin Kelly uses is, first of all, don't think of technology just as like, industrial machines, but like, a violin is a technology. Musical instruments, any musical instrument, the language of writing music, that's a technology. The alphabet is a technology. The oil painting, right? That what we use to make oil paintings, that's a technology. And so what he says is, imagine how impoverished this world would be if we didn't invent the technology of oil painting in time for Van Gogh and his genius to emerge through that. Or if we didn't invent the technology of music and musical instruments in time for Beethoven's sublime genius to emerge through that. So when I look to the future, I'm thinking what new instruments that will facilitate the emergence of new artistry, new forms of human beauty that we can't even fathom yet. You know, there's a great book called Shivers Down Your Spine, Cinema, IMAX, and the Immersive View, that talks about how IMAX theaters are the new Gothic cathedrals, because they are these technologies of ecstasies that allow us to get immersed in another world, visit another realm, a liminal realm, a borderland between dreams and reality. So that, for me, is what gets me excited, is what new technologies will allow for the emergence of new forms of expression, beauty, poetry, and the sublime. And that's, you know, that's part of the narrative. That's part of the story that I'm telling through Shots of Awe.
Yeah, no, well, I'm sorry, I was going to ask a question, but I need to stop. And I just, what is the source of all of this energy and passion? Because I feel really boring up here. I'm really sorry if I'm seeming like really low energy. But like, you're always kind of like this. I think so. I mean, I see you on TV, but like, what is it? What's fueling this? I'm just curious.
The truth is that it comes from existential anxiety. You know, I think that...
Sure.
I think anybody who has a desire to write, to paint, to sing, you know, a desire to express oneself, a desire to make a mark in the world, a desire to matter, a desire to plant one's flag. You know, there's a great book that I read that was actually cited by Woody Allen in the movie Annie Hall as one of his favorite books. It's called The Denial of Death, and I really recommend it to everybody. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974, and basically it distilled the human condition. It summarized what it means to be a human being and what is the source of our malaise, what is the source of our angst, but also what is the source of our ecstasy and our passion and our creativity and our lovemaking. And basically he says it's our unique awareness of being mortal beings. We are the only species of animal that can foresee our own death. Not just the immediate threat, but the idea that one day we're gonna die. And that casts a shadow over our greatest ecstasies. That's that existential despair. That's the terror of meaninglessness, right? What does anything matter if it all dissolves into ashes at the end of the day? Now, we've come up with solutions to address the problem of death. One of them is religion, which for many people resolves that tension, but for many it doesn't. The romantic solution to the problem of death is the second one. That's when we deify each other. I fell in love with her, and she is my salvation. She is the wind. She is the sun. But no relationship can bear the burden of godhood. That's a lot of expectations. That's why romance is such a thing today. We all want the person that's going to save us from ourselves, but ultimately that's a lot of pressure to put on a human being, you know? And then lastly, he talks about the final solution to the problem of death, and he says it's creativity, the creative solution. And that can be symbolic creativity, you know, do something wonderful that improves the world, and you'll still die, but maybe they'll make a statue, you know, in your name, or they'll write a poem about your contribution. So that's the initial creative solution to the problem of death. But after that one comes what we're seeing today through technology. So advances in biotechnology are going to revolutionize healthcare. We're going to upgrade and reprogram our biology. We're going to create synthetic genes that are going to like tell us to live longer, teach our bodies how to not decay. We might even cure aging. I mean, who knows? So it's almost like the idea that our creativity was a symbolic way to address our mortality might ultimately, in the ultimate cosmic joke, be the solution to our finitude. Because again, human beings, that is the dichotomy of what it means to be human. We write poetry, we sing rapturous songs and make beautiful films. We get the shivers down our spine. I mean, we get to taste this transcendence. We get to hint at something larger than ourselves, a hidden door, a rabbit hole to fall through, right? But maybe we're going to literalize that possibility for ourselves. Instead of merely glimpsing it during brief moments of reverie, maybe that is the fate of the human spirit, to create and engineer a nirvana for ourselves here on earth.
Wow. Do you mind if I ask you, right? You kind of need to all pause and just take that in. Would you mind if I ask you, what is your definition of God?
Well, Joseph Campbell used to say, God is that which exceeds our intellectual capacity. And that was a better, I think, an interesting way of describing it, because the word has been hijacked by so many different agendas. You know, Stuart Brand said, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. In other words, an omnipotent being can create, but he can also destroy. And if we get good at playing at the omnipotence game, then we should try to create instead of destroy. The Craig Venter is his name. He's the guy that created the first artificial organism, essentially, like artificial life. And when he was creating it, they asked him, "Don't you think that you're playing God here?" And his response was, "Who's playing?" And so I think that we need to take responsibility for ourselves. That's what I think. And we can't expect other forces to take care of our problems for us. And I think that we have inside of us the capacity to achieve everything we've attributed to higher deities. And so, are we Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods? Or are we going to be Icarus, flying too close to the sun and getting killed? You know, I hope we are Promethean, and I hope we win.
Well, I could talk to you forever, but I have one more question that I want to ask, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. You talked in one of your videos in Shots of Awe about the tension that we feel as human beings between wanting to fully realize our potential as individuals and resisting the tug of conformity towards a zombified existence and blindly following others as in a herd of sheep. Now, that's a good question. How do we resist that tug of conformity, and why is that important?
Well, it's interesting. We did a brain games experiment about conformity where we set up hidden cameras and we had some people that worked for the show start standing in line. There was no sign that said stand in line. There was no instruction like if you stand in line, there's going to be a show. Nothing. They just start standing in line. And as people walked by them, more and more people started to get in the line. Again, there was no explanation. There was no like this is what we're waiting for. Nothing. And as time passed, and we had the hidden camera, more and more people, and the more people stood in line, the more people would stand in line faster and faster. And so it was like a domino effect or a snowball effect. And it was a prime example of conformity, but like to a level that's like almost unconscious, right? Like it's like people didn't even know why they were conforming. And yet, we live in a society that promotes nonconformity above all else. Be the entrepreneur of your own life, you know, be a winner. You know, make your mark on the world. This is an individualistic society that celebrates being salmon swimming upstream. And yet so many of us fall into the pressure of social conformity because to a certain degree we're wired that way. So there's biology that tells us get together with groups, follow the herd, it's easier. But then there's our mind that says, I want to be the hero of my own life. So I point people to one of my heroes, Joseph Campbell. I think he's got the greatest sort of technology for nonconformity, his sort of map of the hero's journey. It's a great archetype. I would say it's a kind of cognitive technology that it's like a map that allows you to put your own life in the context of the hero and figure out if A, are you answering the call to adventure? B, are you overcoming significant obstacles that teach you something about yourself? C, are you having an apotheotic realization and then making that return and bringing that knowledge back? You know, I got the message, now hang up the phone and go share that knowledge with the world. And so whenever people ask me about nonconformity, I would say, look, follow your bliss and check out the work of Joseph Campbell because it's really wonderful.
Thank you, Jason, for being here and sharing your incredible mind with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here.